Hello, this is a video about raising shadows in high contrast images. It's linked to a thread at DP Review called Reconsidering JPEG, and I'll put a link to that thread in the description of this video at YouTube. There are two questions I want to look at in this video. One is it better to use JPEG or RAW when you're trying to raise shadows a long way? And the other is it better to use a camera with a larger sensor? Now, the answer that I'd expect to both those questions is yes, it's better to use a camera with a larger sensor, and yes, it's better to use RAW. Let's see how it goes. We're looking here at a scene from the inside of what we laughingly call our garage. It was a very sunny day, and this garage has a window up to the right of the door, but it's mainly blocked by various things leaning against it. So there's quite a nice big contrast between the outside and the inside. And what I'm going to try and do is to reveal what's in the dark areas. I captured images with 4 cameras. A Canon 70D, which has an APS-C sensor, a Panasonic G5, which has a Micro Four Thirds sensor, an FZ200 and a TZ60, both of which have a 1/2.3 inch sensor. In terms of areas, the 70D has 10 times more area than the TZ60 or the FZ200. For this scene, and we are going to look at another scene after this, but for this scene I'm going to look at the 70D and the TZ60. What I did with each camera was to take a series of photos and watched the blinkers on the LCD screen, and I kept reducing the exposure until I got no blinkers showing. And I had to reduce the exposure by different amounts for the cameras. This one with the 70D I had to reduce by, the camera thought that it was 1/3 of a stop underexposed for this one. For the one I'm going to use for the TZ60, the camera thought it was 2 whole stops underexposed. To get a similar looking one for the FZ200, I had to go 2 1/3 stops underexposed. For the G5, I had to use 1 1/3 stops underexposure. So the idea was to get a starting position which was, roughly speaking, the same. If I can get this to work. In terms of the highlights, here's the highlights here for the 70D. This is the out of camera JPEG. Here it is for the FZ200, and although there's much more showing here, when I went 1/3 stop beneath that, all those disappeared. Here is the G5, again similar looking to the FZ200, but not underexposed as much. And finally the TZ60, which looks really solidly underexposed, but here too, when I went 1/3 of a stop down from this, they all disappeared. So this is the image I'm going to use for the TZ60, and this is the one that I'm going to use for the 70D. They look rather different in terms of the highlights, clipped highlights that are showing, but in fact they're only 1/3 a stop away, each of them, from having no clipped highlights showing at all on the LCD. Now what I've done in both cases is to run this image, and it's a pair of JPEG and RAW images. I've run them through the batch file that I've been discussing in the thread at DP Review. And in this particular case, it gives a rather curious effect. This is what the JPEG looks like after it's been run through that batch process. And this is what the RAW looks like. Now this looks like a very unpromising start, but in fact I've been playing with this, trying to process the RAW and the out of the camera JPEG. In fact, I've done best starting from these two versions, unlikely as it may seem. So these have already been processed with that batch process. Now if we turn that off and look at the histogram, we can see that it's empty at the top. Well, that's hardly surprising because the whole thing is underexposed. So what I'm going to do is to pull the whites up to close that gap. And there we are, it's gone quite bright outside. That's fine. What I'm going to do now is to pull the shadows up. And we can see as I do that the overexposure is getting worse on the outside. Now I'm doing this wrongly with the JPEG. I wanted to start actually with the RAW, so I'll do the same thing again. We've got a gap at the top of the histogram. I'll pull the whites up to close that gap down. There we are, it's brighter outside. And now I'll draw the shadows up, and I'm going to pull them all the way up. Now that in turn has caused the highlighting to increase on the outside, so I'm going to pull the highlights down a little. And there we are, that's absolutely as far as I can get that in Lightroom from that starting position, and this is better than I could get if I was starting with the RAW that hasn't been messed around with. So if I now look at the JPEG and I do the same thing, which I was halfway through before, I'd pulled the whites up, I'll pull the shadows right up, and I'll take the highlights down. Now we can compare these two. If I turn off that, it'll make it a little bigger, and turn off that. If I now zoom in, sorry, that's not going to work, I have to have that. This is the, let's look at the RAW, and if we go backwards and forwards, that's the RAW, that's the JPEG, and you can see the colours are very different. There's a very green look on the inside to the JPEG, and this is the RAW, and that's more of the colour. I mean, it still looks a bit odd, but it's certainly not green on that wall. If we go in now and have a look at this, this is the top of a spade on the RAW version, and this is what it looks like on the JPEG version. And back to the RAW and back to the JPEG. So I think there's no doubt in my mind that the RAW has done a lot better on that. If we now go and look at this bush over here, and we're looking at the RAW version now, and I go and have a look here, and I go backwards and forwards, again, that's the RAW, that's the JPEG, and the RAW is much better defined. The JPEG is looking vague, mushy. Now this is with the better of the cameras, so you can imagine what's going to happen when we try doing this same trick with a camera which has a sensor 1/10 of the size of the one we've just been looking at. However, let's have a bit of fun, let's do it. So this is what the out of the camera JPEG looks like with all those highlights. So I'm going to do what I did before. We're starting with the two that have been processed already, and they look dark, although oddly enough they don't look quite as dark as the ones from the 70D did at this stage. So I now need to have this back, and there's a gap at the top of the histogram, so I'll pull the whites up. Now I'll pull the shadows as far as I can, and There isn't much extra by way of highlights, so whoops, I double clicked wrongly then. So let's take the highlights back down to where they should be. There we go, the highlights have gone now. And I'll look at the JPEG. We've got the gap at the top of the histogram, so I'll bring the whites up to fill the histogram. I'll bring the shadows up as far as I can, and I'll take the highlights down to get rid of the clipping. And we've now got, this is the JPEG and this is the RAW. And again, it doesn't have that horrible green colour here on the wall in the JPEG, but the light looks a bit better to my eye in the RAW one, which we're looking at now. If we look closer at this, this is the top of the spade in the RAW version, and here it is in the JPEG version. Now, oddly enough, there isn't as much difference this time as there was with the 70D, which I find rather puzzling. There's also something else going on, which is these dots all over the place. And if we go and look in the really dark region, I mean, there's masses of these things. When you look at this, you can't actually see this on the video, but if you look at this at the normal size that I look at things, you can actually see these dots over here spoiling it, which is a pity. And this is the RAW version, and if we go in, you can see they're there as well. So it's a bit of a disappointment that these don't get these dots in the 70D version. If we go and have a close look at that area, this is the RAW for the 70D. Oh, well, I tell a lie. There are dots there, but they aren't as prominent. They don't notice as much when you're looking at this at my normal sort of output size, but it is still quite spotty. So that's the situation with raising shadows a lot with two different cameras using the same technique. And let's just have a look a moment at, just go backwards and forwards. This is the 70D version, and this is not the other one that I'm looking at. Let me try this again. That's the 70D version, and this is the TZ60 version. Both of these are RAW, and if I go backwards and forwards between them, that's the 70D, that's the TZ60. At this size, I find it quite interesting that the TZ60 is actually done quite well. I know there are those dots there and so on, but I'm still quite surprised that it's done as well as it has, granted the fact it's only got 1/10 of the size of its sensor. So that's a bit of a surprise for me. Let's now have a look at the second example, and we need to go to a different directory for this, which means I need to go into the library module and go to this directory and go back to develop. Right, this is a sunset. This was last night, and here we have, I'm only going to do this for one camera. This is the FZ200, so we're doing a RAW versus JPEG comparison here. This is the out of the camera JPEG with a bit of highlight clipping showing, and what we've got is the two versions that have already been through the batch process. This is the batch process applied to the JPEG, and this is it applied to the RAW file. Now what I'm going to do is the same procedure as I did for the first example. However, this time, if we look at the histogram, it's different. There's no gap at the top. Now this is a fairly high contrast scene because we're looking directly at the sun there, although it is partly blocked by the clouds. So it's a fairly high contrast scene. Presumably it's not as high contrast as the previous one, I don't know. But anyway, the batch process hasn't done exactly the same thing to it, and it hasn't left the gap at the top, which means I don't need to pull the whites up to fill the gap. So what I'll try doing is the next thing that I did was to pull the shadows up. That's increased the highlights very slightly. So I'll pull the highlights down just a fraction. The other thing is that everything looks, it's got a somewhat of an HDR look to it. It's rather flat in the bottom area, and I'm going to decrease the blacks a bit, just to try and take the edge off that very low contrast look that the bottom half of the image has got. Now I'm going to do the similar thing for the JPEG. Again, we haven't got a gap at the top, so I can simply take the shadows up, take the highlights down, and bring the blacks down a bit. There we go. Now what I'm going to compare is this area down here in the two images by this pole. So this is the raw version, and we're looking at this 100%, I think. And this is the JPEG version. Now I think even on the video you're going to be able to see that there's a massive difference between these two. That's the JPEG, that's the RAW, and the RAW is hugely better than the JPEG. So the conclusion I draw from this exercise, I know it's only two examples, but it looks very much like it's better to use RAW than JPEG if you're going to try and raise shadows a long way. And as to the other question, well, that's a bit of a puzzle. I can't help feeling it must be better using a camera with a much larger sensor. However, the evidence on that one example that we looked at rather muddies the picture a bit. So I suppose the answer to that question is try it with the particular camera that you've got and see how it goes. See if you've got a usable result from it. I'm not sure. Actually, the TZ60 was pretty good, but it did have all those spots, and I think that probably would make it unusable unless you did an unbearable amount of touching up on it. Whereas the one from the 70D probably was usable at my normal output size of 1300 pixels high for screen viewing. But I'm still pretty surprised about the result we got with that one. So that's it for this exercise. That's it for now, and goodbye.